We are always surprised when new information comes available over time. This story was published in the newspaper The Sun on October 7th, 1888. However, it really never made it to the main story of the Hatfield and McCoy feud legend until recently. Chapter 5 is a tad long, and so today we will be reading from the chapter directly, with the discussion to follow next week. However, we must let it be said that we have not heard this section of the feud before now, but we are finding through our research that this did indeed take place. We also must state that the following reading is very violent against two innocent women, Mrs. Mary Daniels and Mrs. Tom Wallace, in this version of the story, or Nancy McCoy Hatfield in other versions of this story. And we must also state that this article speaks of an ambush on the side of the road. If you are sensitive toward these topics, please skip this reading and wait for next week's findings. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up the time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine for our flight back in time, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger vehicle to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. The reading of the newspaper article. Quote, Chapter 5, Outrages by the Hatfields. Quote, Ants, he's got some boys that's mighty mean. Ants can't do nothing with 'em, and never could. Cap, he's given us trouble ever since he was table high. They've went on and carried on till I don't blame the authorities for trying to punish such trifling fellers. Unquote. That is what Elias Hatfield, brother of Bad Ants, and one of the murderers of the three McCoys, had to say about Ant's boys when asked for a history of the feud by the Sun reporter. In June 1884, an attempt was made to kill both Randolph McCoy and his son Calvin. That resulted in maiming for life two inoffensive citizens through a curious mistake. It will be remembered that the killing of the good Deacon Hatfield occurred at an election when the brother-in-law Tom Stafford was candidate for justice of the peace. Of course, Tom was elected. Now, when Talbert's estate was settled, Calvin looked after the interest of the widow and was obliged to bring several suits to establish her rights. It some way happened that the Logan regulators heard when one of these suits was to have a hearing, and accordingly, knowing that both old Randall and Calvin would be present, formed a plan to kill them both. Cap and John C. Hatfield, Mose Christian, Lee Wilson, Ellison Mounts, Harvey Smith, and Bill Tom Hatfield took guns and hid themselves in the brush on the mountainside a few rods above the road over which the McCoys would travel when going home after the trial. Once their ambush was fixed, a little son of Justice Stafford was seen passing along the road, and Cap stopped him and made him bring an accurate description of the dress and arms of both Randolph McCoy and Calvin. But the boy overlooked one circumstance. Two of the witnesses at the trial, John and Hence Scott, happened to not only be dressed as were Randolph and Calvin McCoy, but they had beards of the same cut and color. The sun had gone down behind a mountain when the trial was over, and the parties to the trial filed out. The first to come were the Scotts. They, with Sam McCoy, son of Randolph, started down the road before the rest appeared. The bushwhackers supposed that they had three of the McCoys before them, and as they got opposite of the ambush, fired. One ball pierced John Scott's right knee, and he fell to the ground. Another plowed through Hence Scott's right shoulder directly under Sam McCoy's hand. Sam felt the flesh and clothing rise under his hand as the bullet cut through the flesh and bones. Hence and Sam jumped over the bank down below the road, a mere bridle path, and got out of the sight while John had to lie there in the dust, exposed to the fire of the bushwhackers. He closed his eyes and lay as still as possible while the balls cut and plowed up the dirt of the road on both sides of him until he was covered with it. Fortunately, no other ball struck him. Among the regulators, as already mentioned, was Tom Wallace. Tom had married a daughter of Bill Daniels, who lived on the Kentucky side of the Tug River. Tom was so ugly to his wife that she was obliged to leave him and return home. Sometime after this, when a raid was contemplated by the Hatfields, the news of it got to the McCoys, so that they fled. Cap Hatfield and Tom Wallace at once concluded that Mrs. Daniels and her daughter, Tom's wife, had betrayed the regulators. So one night Tom and Cap crossed the Tug River to the Daniels cabin. No one ever locks a door in that country unless they are concerned in a feud, and the Daniels door was not even latched. Tom and Cap pushed it open and walked in. The whole family was in bed, all, of course, in one room the cabin contained. A pile of soft coal blazed in the fireplace. Bill Daniels awoke as the intruder strode across the floor. Bill found the muzzle of a cocked repeating rifle in his face as he opened his eyes. It was held by Tom Wallace, and he was told to lie still and say nothing. Then Cap ordered Mrs. Daniels and Mrs. Wallace, her daughter, out of bed. The women obeyed, but began to cry and plead for mercy, at which Cap laughed in glee. He carried in his hand a tail of a cow, which he had cut from an unfortunate brute some time before, just to see her jump, and had it hung up and dried it. He flourished this about his head, and then, grabbing Mrs. Daniels by the hair, forced her to her knees in front of the fireplace and began beating her across the back, using the heavy bone of the cow's tail to strike her with. The blows were delivered with a will. The woman screamed in agony, for the first 2 blows broke 2 ribs, while her cries were added to those of her daughter and several children. Bill Daniels, the husband and father, groaned and turned his head, but Tom ordered him under the pain of death to turn back and keep his eyes on the whipping. From Mrs. Daniels, Cap turned to Mrs. Wallace, her daughter. His arm was somewhat weary now, and he could not beat her to his satisfaction, so he took the gun from Wallace, who, with fresh strength, beat the woman anew. This actual beating lasted over 40 minutes by a little old clock that stood over the fireplace on a shelf. When it was over, both women lie on the floor unconscious. Dead, Daniels supposed, though Mrs. Daniels afterward partly recovered, and Mrs. Wallace is in good health now. Mrs. Daniels' lungs were affected, and she will probably die of consumption inside of a year. Unquote. In next week's video, we will be covering the known facts of both cases. What really happened to Randolph's nephews, John and Henderson Scott? Why were they attending the trial? And was it a trial, or was the McCoys taking their cause to Perry Cline? And what about the 2 women? What were they accused of that caused the brutal beating? Thank you. Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the myths and truths of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive a notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. Please be sure to double check that you are subscribed, as some of our viewers are finding that they are no longer subscribed to our channel. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.